In the small town of Silver Creek, life moved at a slow pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees and everyone seemed to know each other's name, or at least their business. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, but people still found ways to talk about everything. For 16-year-old Jasmine, this sleepy little town felt both familiar and suffocating. She dreamed of bigger things, of writing stories that would change hearts or maybe even singing songs that could touch souls. But today wasn't about dreams. It was just another ordinary day. Jasmine had been sent on an errand by her mom to pick up groceries from the local store. With plastic bags hanging heavily from her arms, she stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and kids played basketball down the street. Everything seemed normal until a police cruiser rolled up beside her, its engine rumbling softly as it came to a stop. The car window slid down, and two officers leaned out, grinning like they'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. In Silver Creek, these two were known for their jokes. They weren't mean-spirited all the time, at least not openly, but their teasing often walked a thin line between harmless banter and outright mockery. Today, though, there was no mistaking the tone. One of them smirked and said something sharp, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Hey, kid," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you didn't steal those groceries? Looks like quite the haul for someone like you." His partner chuckled, adding fuel to the fire. "Yeah, maybe we should check if your pockets are full too." They laughed together, clearly enjoying themselves. Jasmine froze mid-step, her face flushing hot with embarrassment. Her grip tightened around the grocery bags as she tried to ignore them, hoping they'd drive away if she didn't react. But instead, their laughter grew louder, echoing off the quiet neighborhood streets. Pedestrians glanced over curiously, some pretending not to notice while others exchanged uncomfortable looks. No one stepped forward to say anything. Not even Mrs. Peterson, who always waved hello when Jasmine passed her house. Finally, after what felt like forever, the officers drove off, leaving behind only the sound of tires crunching against gravel. Jasmine stood there, rooted to the spot, her chest tightening with anger and shame. She wanted to scream, to shout back at them, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision as she continued walking home. By the time she reached her front door, her hands trembled slightly under the weight of the bags. Her mom greeted her with a smile, asking how the trip went, but Jasmine couldn't bring herself to answer. Something inside her snapped when she saw the concern flash across her mother's face. Without meaning to, she burst into tears, dropping the groceries onto the kitchen counter. Her mom rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "What happened?" she asked gently, brushing Jasmine's hair back from her forehead. At first, Jasmine hesitated, unsure if she should tell the truth. What good would it do? Would anyone believe her over the police? But the story spilled out anyway, tumbling out in broken sentences between sobs. When she finished, her mom hugged her tighter, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. Then she picked up the phone and dialed her husband's number. As the call connected, her voice hardened just a fraction. "You need to come home," she said firmly. "Now." On the other end of the line, Jasmine's dad listened quietly. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that sent shivers through the room. "I'll handle it," he said simply. And with those 3 words, the atmosphere shifted. There was no doubt in anyone's mind. He wasn't going to let this go unanswered. The house was quiet after the phone call, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Jasmine sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wooden surface, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on its worn texture. Her mom moved around the room, tidying up things that didn't need tidying, stacking dishes, folding napkins, anything to keep her hands busy. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Jasmine's mind raced. She replayed the scene over and over in her head. The officers' mocking voices, the way their laughter had echoed through the empty street, the feeling of being completely alone despite being surrounded by neighbors. It wasn't just what they said. It was how they made her feel, small, powerless, unseen. And now, here she was, sitting in her own home, dreading what might happen next. Would her dad march straight to the police station? Would he confront the officers himself? Or worse, would this escalate into something bigger, something she couldn't control? Her mom broke the silence first. "You did nothing wrong," she said firmly, setting a glass of water in front of Jasmine. "Remember that no matter what anyone says or does, you are not to blame for how they choose to treat you." Jasmine nodded slowly, but the words didn't fully sink in. How could she believe them when the sting of humiliation still burned so fresh? Still, there was comfort in hearing her mom's voice. Steady, sure, protective. It reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone, even if the world outside sometimes felt hostile. A little while later, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway signaled her dad's return. He walked in quietly, his boots thudding softly against the tiled floor as he closed the door behind him. His presence filled the room immediately, not because he was loud or imposing, but because there was something about him that commanded attention. He carried himself with a quiet strength, the kind that came from years of facing challenges head-on without backing down. He hung up his jacket and turned to face them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, without asking for details, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from Jasmine. Leaning forward slightly, he rested his elbows on the table and looked directly into her eyes. "Tell me everything," he said simply. His tone wasn't angry or accusatory. It was calm, steady, inviting. But Jasmine hesitated. She didn't want to relive the moment again, especially not with him. What if he got mad? What if he did something reckless? She had seen flashes of his temper before, though it was always directed toward situations, never people. Even so, the thought of unleashing that energy scared her. Her mom placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Go ahead," she encouraged softly. "It's okay." Taking a deep breath, Jasmine began to recount the story. She started slowly, stumbling over her words at first. But as she spoke, the floodgates opened. She told him about the officers pulling up beside her, their cruel comments, the laughter that followed. She described the way passers-by had ignored her plight, pretending not to notice as she stood frozen on the sidewalk. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face once more, but this time, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of release, of finally letting it all out. Her dad listened intently, his jaw tightening ever so slightly with each word. When she was done, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, grounding her in the moment. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "You held your head high, even when they tried to knock you down. That takes courage." Jasmine blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected those words, not from him, not after everything she'd just shared. But somehow, they made her chest swell with a tiny spark of pride. Maybe she had handled it better than she thought. Then, without another word, her dad stood up and headed toward the hallway. He grabbed his keys from the hook near the door and slipped on his jacket. Before stepping outside, he paused and glanced back at them. "I'll take care of this," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet intensity as before. "No one talks to my family like that and gets away with it." And with that, he was gone. Jasmine and her mom exchanged worried glances. They knew him well enough to understand what those words meant. He wasn't planning to let this slide. Whatever taking care of it involved, it wouldn't be passive or half-hearted. He was going to make sure justice was served, in his own way. As the minutes ticked by, Jasmine alternated between feeling relieved and anxious. On one hand, it was comforting to know that someone was standing up for her, fighting back against the unfairness she'd experienced. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the fear of what might come next. Would this create more trouble for her? Would people judge her family even more harshly? These questions swirled in her mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. Mom must have sensed her unease because she sat down beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Whatever happens," she said gently, "we're in this together. You, me, and your dad. We stick together, no matter what." Jasmine leaned into her embrace, drawing strength from the warmth of her mother's arms. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, She felt safe. Safe enough to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Night was falling, but inside the house, a quiet determination burned bright. Something had shifted today, not just for Jasmine, but for her entire family. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning, the air in Silver Creek felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just the humidity or the looming clouds that promised rain. It was the tension hanging over the town like an invisible storm. Jasmine woke up early, her mind racing, with thoughts of what her dad might do. She hadn't slept much the night before, tossing and turning as she replayed his words in her head. No one talks to my family like that and gets away with it. Her mom had tried to reassure her before bed, saying that he always thought things through, no matter how fiery his words sounded. But Jasmine couldn't shake the image of him walking out the door the previous evening, determination etched into every step. What exactly did taking care of it mean? Would he confront the officers directly? Would he go to the police station? Or would he take a completely different approach altogether? By the time breakfast rolled around, Jasmine's nerves were frayed. Her mom bustled around the kitchen, making pancakes even though neither of them had much of an appetite. The clatter of dishes and the sizzle of batter on the stove filled the silence between them. Neither spoke much, but the unspoken understanding lingered. He would handle it his way, and they had to trust him. Around mid-morning, Jasmine heard the sound of the front door opening. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed to see who it was. Sure enough, her dad stood there, still wearing the same jacket he'd left in the night before. His expression gave nothing away, but there was a glint in his eye, a mix of resolve and quiet confidence that made her feel both reassured and uneasy at the same time. Without waiting for questions, he walked straight to the kitchen table and sat down. He placed a small notebook on the surface and flipped it open. Inside were scribbled notes, names, dates, details about the incident. Jasmine realized he'd spent the entire night planning, mapping out exactly how he intended to address the situation. "I went to the station last night," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "Not to start trouble, but to make sure they knew we weren't going to let this slide." Jasmine's eyes widened. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her dad leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "I talked to the chief of police, told him everything you told us last night. I didn't raise my voice, didn't lose my temper, I just laid out the facts, and I made it clear that this isn't just about you. It's about respect. About treating people fairly no matter who they are." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued. "At first, the chief seemed defensive. You could tell he didn't want to admit there was a problem. But when I showed him these notes and reminded him that this kind of behavior reflects poorly on the whole department, he started listening. By the end of the conversation, he promised to look into it, said he'd speak to the officers involved and review their conduct." Jasmine felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly followed by doubt. Promises were easy to make, especially when someone was being watched closely. What if nothing changed? What if the officers denied saying anything wrong? She voiced her concerns hesitantly, afraid of sounding ungrateful. Her dad nodded, acknowledging her fears. "You're right to be cautious," he said. "Words are cheap unless they're backed by action. That's why I also requested a meeting with the entire department. Not just the officers involved, but everyone. I want them to hear our side of the story, to understand why this matters." Jasmine blinked in surprise. "A meeting? With all of them?" "Yes," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "And it's not just going to be me talking. I've got some help coming." Before she could ask what he meant, her mom chimed in from the doorway. "Your dad's been busy," she said with a small smile. "He reached out to Pastor Lewis last night. Remember him? He leads the gospel choir at church, the one that performs at community events." Jasmine nodded slowly, piecing it together. The choir, officially called Voices of Grace, was known throughout Silver Creek for their soulful music and uplifting messages. They often sang at weddings, funerals, and local festivals, bringing people together with their harmonies. But what did they have to do with this? "They're going to join us at the meeting," her dad explained. "Sometimes words aren't enough to open hearts. Music has a way of reaching places that arguments can't touch. These officers need to hear something softer, something that speaks to the soul instead of the ego." Jasmine's chest tightened with emotion. She couldn't imagine what it would be like, standing in front of a room full of police officers, sharing her story while a choir sang behind her. Part of her wanted to protest, to say it was too much, too personal. But another part of her, a deeper, quieter part, felt a spark of courage ignite within her. Maybe this was her chance to turn pain into purpose, to show the world that she wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. Her mom must have sensed her inner turmoil because she came over and hugged her tightly. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," she whispered. "We'll figure it out together." Jasmine nodded, grateful for the support. For now, though, she focused on the plan her dad had set in motion. A meeting with the police department, a choir singing songs of forgiveness and unity, and somewhere in the middle of it all, her own voice telling her truth. As the day wore on, word of the upcoming meeting spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. Neighbors whispered about it over fences. Shopkeepers discussed it during lunch breaks, and kids talked about it on playgrounds. Some were skeptical, others curious, but everyone agreed on one thing: something big was about to happen in their sleepy little town. That evening, as Jasmine lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she found herself thinking about the choir. Their voices had always brought comfort to her during tough times, filling the church with a warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. If anyone could soften hardened hearts, it was them. And maybe, just maybe, their music could pave the way for change. Not just for her, but for everyone in Silver Creek. With that thought lingering in her mind, she finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of melodies that carried hope and healing. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The evening of the meeting arrived, and Silver Creek buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't every day that the police department opened its doors to the public for something like this. Word had spread quickly, through phone calls, text messages, and casual conversations at the grocery store or gas station. People who usually stayed out of town affairs found themselves curious. What exactly was going to happen? Why had a gospel choir been invited? And most importantly, how would the officers react? Jasmine's dad stood outside the police station early that evening, waiting as members of Voices of Grace began to arrive. The choir had agreed without hesitation when he reached out, understanding the weight of what they were being asked to. Their leader, Pastor Lewis, greeted him warmly, his calm demeanor putting everyone at ease. "You're doing the right thing," Pastor Lewis said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't about revenge or punishment, it's about healing. For your family, for the officers, and for this community." Her dad nodded, though his jaw remained tight with determination. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Confronting. People in power rarely was. But he also believed that true change came from difficult conversations, the kind that forced people to look inward and reflect. Inside the station, chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing a makeshift stage where the choir would perform. Officers filed in slowly, some looking uncomfortable, others pretending not to care. A few exchanged nervous glances, whispering among themselves. They didn't know what to expect, but the presence of the choir hinted that this wasn't going to be an ordinary briefing. Jasmine sat near the back of the room with her mom, feeling small and exposed despite the crowd. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the faces around her. Some of the officers avoided eye contact, while others stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. She spotted the two men who had mocked her the other day, sitting side by side near the front. Their smirks were gone now, replaced by stiff postures and uneasy fidgeting. When everyone was seated, her dad stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He wore his old work boots and a simple button-up shirt, nothing flashy, but his presence commanded attention. Clearing his throat, he began to speak. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he started, his voice steady and clear. "I know this isn't something you signed up for when you joined the force. But sometimes life throws us challenges we don't anticipate. and how we respond defines who we are." He paused, letting his words settle over the room before continuing. "A few days ago, my daughter was humiliated in broad daylight by two officers who thought it was funny to make fun of her. They made assumptions about her based on stereotypes, and they laughed at her expense. That moment broke her spirit, but it also woke me up." His tone softened slightly, though it still carried a weight that silenced any potential whispers. "This isn't just about one incident or one family. It's about respect, about seeing people, not their race, their clothes, or their background, but seeing them as human beings deserving of dignity. You swore an oath to protect and serve, but protection means more than just keeping people safe from crime. It means treating them with fairness and compassion no matter who they are." As he spoke, Jasmine felt tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to share so much, to lay bare the pain she'd felt in such raw terms. Yet hearing him say it aloud gave her strength. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that her hurt mattered and it deserved to be acknowledged. When he finished speaking, he stepped aside and gestured toward the choir. "Words can only go so far," he said simply. "Sometimes music speaks louder than anything else." The members of Voices of Grace took their places quietly, adjusting their robes and instruments. There was no grand introduction, no dramatic build-up, just the soft strumming of a guitar as they began to sing. The first notes floated through the room like a gentle breeze, carrying with them a sense of peace and reflection. Their voices blended seamlessly, creating harmonies that seemed to fill every corner of the space. The song they chose was simple yet powerful, a hymn about forgiveness and unity. As they sang, the tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, deeper. Officers who had entered the room with crossed arms and skeptical expressions now leaned forward slightly, listening intently. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others glanced at each other, sharing subtle nods of understanding. Jasmine watched it all unfold, her breath catching in her throat. She saw the exact moment when the message hit home for some of the officers. One man wiped away a tear, his face hidden behind his hand. Another shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze dropping to the floor. Even the two officers who had mocked her seemed visibly moved, their shoulders slumping under the weight of the lyrics. When the final note faded into silence, no one clapped or cheered. Instead, there was a profound stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Pastor Lewis stepped forward then, his voice warm and inviting. "We're here not to judge, but to remind you of the power of grace," he said. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to move forward together with open hearts and open minds." Afterward, the chief of police addressed the group, his tone unusually somber. "What happened was unacceptable," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "It doesn't reflect the values of this department or the trust we're supposed to uphold. We will take action to ensure this never happens again." Jasmine exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. For so long she'd carried the weight of that day alone, convinced that nothing could undo the damage. But now, surrounded by music and honesty, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. As the meeting drew to a close, several officers approached her dad to apologize personally. Some even sought her out, offering quiet words of regret. Jasmine accepted their apologies graciously, though she knew it would take time to fully heal. Still, the cracks in the wall of mistrust had begun to show and light was starting to seep through. That night, as she walked home with her parents, she felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying had finally been lifted. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days she dared to hope. Hope that her story might inspire others to speak up, to seek justice, and to believe in the possibility of redemption, even in the unlikeliest of places. In the days following the meeting, Silver Creek felt different. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably so. Conversations that once revolved around gossip or complaints about potholes in the road now turned toward bigger topics: respect, fairness, and how people treated one another. It wasn't just talk either. Small changes began to ripple through the community, like pebbles dropped into a still pond. For Jasmine, life slowly started to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be after everything she'd been through. The weight of humiliation that had pressed down on her chest for days began to lift, replaced by something lighter, brighter. She didn't wake up each morning dreading what others might say or do. Instead, she found herself looking ahead, imagining possibilities she hadn't dared to consider before. Her dad's actions and the choir's music had sparked something in her. For years, she'd written poems and short stories in secret, filling notebooks with words no one else ever read. But now, inspired by the courage it took to stand up and share her truth, she decided it was time to let her voice be heard. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table, she pulled out an old notebook and flipped through its pages. Some entries were messy scribbles, others carefully crafted verses, but all of them carried pieces of her heart. "I think I want to enter the poetry contest at school," she said suddenly, glancing up at her mom, who was chopping vegetables nearby. Her mom paused mid-slice, a smile spreading across her face. "That's wonderful," she replied, setting the knife down and turning to face Jasmine fully. "What made you decide?" Jasmine shrugged, tracing a finger along the edge of the notebook. "I don't know. Maybe because I finally feel like my story matters. Like it could help someone else understand what it's like to go through something like this." Her mom's eyes softened, pride shining in them. "Your story does matter," she said firmly. "And if you're brave enough to share it, people will listen." Encouraged by her mom's support, Jasmine spent hours revising her work, pouring her emotions onto the page. Her poem, titled "The Band That Spoke Softly," wove together the events of the past week, the pain, the confrontation, the music that brought healing, and ended with a message of hope. By the time she submitted it to the contest committee, she felt both terrified and exhilarated, unsure of what to expect but proud of herself for taking the leap. Meanwhile, the impact of the meeting continued to spread beyond Jasmine's family. Neighbors who had long harbored resentment toward the police department began to see glimpses of change. Officers started attending community events more frequently, not just to patrol, but to engage with residents. They hosted barbecues, joined local cleanup efforts, and even participated in a charity basketball game against high school students. At first, some townsfolk remained skeptical, keeping their distance, but over time, walls began to crumble. The two officers who had mocked Jasmine issued public apologies during a town hall meeting. Their words were heartfelt, though awkward, and they admitted they hadn't realized the harm their jokes caused until they sat in that room and listened to the choir sing. Afterward, they volunteered to lead workshops on cultural sensitivity within the department, determined to learn from their mistakes. Even Pastor Lewis and the members of Voices of Grace became regular fixtures in the community. Their performances weren't limited to church services anymore. They sang at retirement, homes, schools, and parks, using their music to bridge gaps between people. Their message was always the same: forgiveness, unity, and the power of love to heal wounds. One evening, as Jasmine walked home from practice with her mom, she noticed a group of kids playing soccer near the park. Among them was a young boy kicking the ball with his friends, laughing freely. Just weeks ago, she might have envied his carefree spirit, wishing she could unburden herself of the weight she carried. But now, watching him, she felt only gratitude for the lessons she'd learned, for the strength she'd discovered within herself, and for the way her community was beginning to come together. At school, news of her poem submission spread quickly among her classmates. Some teased her good-naturedly, calling her the poet, while others offered genuine encouragement. When the day of the competition arrived, Jasmine stood backstage, clutching her notebook tightly. Her heart raced as she listened to other contestants recite their pieces, each one more impressive than the last. Doubts crept in. What if her poem wasn't good enough? What if no one understood what she was trying to say? But then she remembered her dad's steady voice, her mom's unwavering support and the choir's soft melodies that had spoken directly to her soul. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage, her legs trembling slightly beneath her. The spotlight blinded her for a moment, but when she looked out into the audience, she saw familiar faces smiling back at her. Her parents sat in the front row, beaming with pride, and next to them were members of Voices of Grace, nodding encouragingly. She began to read, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each line. As she spoke, she poured every ounce of emotion she'd felt over the past weeks into her words. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that comes when people are truly listening, hanging on every syllable. When she finished, there was a beat of stillness before applause erupted, filling the auditorium with warmth and approval. Though she didn't win first place, Jasmine left the stage feeling victorious. For the first time, she realized that sharing her story wasn't about winning awards or gaining recognition. It was about connecting with others, showing them they weren't alone, and proving that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. Back home, her dad hugged her tightly, his eyes glistening with tears. "You did it," he whispered. "You showed them what real strength looks like." As the weeks turned into months, Jasmine's poem gained attention beyond the school. Teachers encouraged her to submit it to regional competitions, and soon, invitations to perform at larger events rolled in. Each time she stepped onto a new stage, she thought of her journey. From the sidewalk where she'd felt invisible to the rooms filled with people eager to hear her voice. Silver Creek wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was changing. Slowly, steadily, the cracks in its foundation were being repaired piece by piece. And at the center of it all was a girl who refused to stay silent, a father who believed in justice, and a band that reminded everyone that sometimes, the softest voices carry the loudest messages. Years passed and Silver Creek continued to transform in ways both big and small. The town wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it had grown into something kinder, more connected. Conversations that once centered on divisions or grievances now focused on shared dreams for the future. People who had lived side by side for decades without truly knowing one another began to see each other as neighbors rather than strangers. It was a slow process, like planting seeds in rocky soil, but with care and patience, those seeds eventually took root. For Jasmine, life unfolded in ways she could never have imagined during those painful days when the world felt so heavy. Her poem, "The Band That Spoke Softly," became more than just words on paper. It became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up and speaking out. Regional competitions led to statewide recognition, and soon her work caught the attention of writers and artists far beyond Silver Creek. She started performing at events across the country, sharing not only her poetry but also her story. Each time she stepped onto a stage, she carried with her the lessons she'd learned, that vulnerability isn't weakness, and courage can inspire others to find their own voices. One evening, years after the meeting at the police station, Jasmine stood backstage at a national poetry slam. The venue buzzed with energy, filled with people eager to hear from poets whose words had touched hearts and sparked change. As she waited for her turn, she glanced down at the notebook in her hands, the same one she'd clutched nervously all those years ago during her first performance. Its pages were worn and dog-eared now, marked by countless revisions and late-night scribbles. But inside it lay the piece that had started everything. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage, the spotlight warm against her skin. For a moment she closed her eyes, letting the hum of anticipation wash over her. Then she opened them, scanning the audience until she found what she was looking for. A tall figure standing near the back, his arms crossed but his face beaming with pride. Beside him sat her mom, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and next to them were members of Voices of Grace, smiling softly. Their presence grounded her, reminding her of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled. She began to recite her poem, her voice steady and clear. As she spoke, she painted a vivid picture of that day, the officers' laughter, the sting of humiliation, the fear of being unseen. But she didn't stop there. She described the quiet strength of her dad, the way he refused to let injustice go unanswered. She recounted the choir's music, how its soft notes had softened hardened hearts. And finally, she ended with hope, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal if given enough love, understanding, and time. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Not the awkward silence of discomfort, but the profound stillness of reflection. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd, growing louder and more passionate until it filled every corner of the space. Jasmine bowed her head, overwhelmed by emotion, as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or unheard. Her words had become a mirror for their pain and a window to healing. Afterward, as she mingled with the audience, people approached her to share their own stories. A young woman told her about being bullied at school and finding solace in her poems. An older man recounted a similar experience with law enforcement decades earlier, saying he wished someone had stood up for him the way her family had stood up for her. Each story reinforced what she already knew. Art had the power to connect people across differences, to remind them they weren't alone. Back home in Silver Creek, the changes continued to take hold. The police department implemented new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and accountability, ensuring that officers understood the weight of their roles as protectors and servants. Community meetings became regular occurrences, fostering open dialogue between residents and law enforcement. Trust, once shattered, began to rebuild brick by brick. Voices of Grace remained a cornerstone of the town's transformation. Their performances evolved beyond gospel music to include original compositions inspired by the stories of those around them. They sang at weddings, funerals, protests, and celebrations, always carrying a message of unity and hope. Pastor Lewis often joked that they were less a choir and more a band of peace builders, using their voices to mend what was broken. As for Jasmine's parents, they watched with quiet pride as their daughter blossomed into a leader, an advocate, and an artist. Her dad still worked tirelessly in his workshop, crafting furniture that would last for generations. But now he also spent time mentoring young people in the community, teaching them skills not just in carpentry, but in resilience and integrity. Her mom joined local initiatives aimed at supporting families facing challenges, drawing on her own experiences to guide others. On weekends, the family gathered around the dinner table, laughing and sharing updates about their lives. Sometimes they talked about the past, not with bitterness but with gratitude for the lessons it had taught them. Other times, they dreamed about the future, imagining all the good they could continue to do together. One summer evening, as the sun dipped low behind the oak trees, Jasmine sat on the porch swing with her dad. The air smelled sweet with blooming flowers, and fireflies blinked lazily in the twilight. She leaned back, letting the rhythm of the swing lull her into calmness. No, she said after a while. I used to think that day ruined me, like it stole something I'd never get back. Her dad nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It did take something, he admitted. But it gave you something too, strength, purpose, a voice. Jasmine smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. What had started as a moment of pain had grown into a legacy of healing. She thought about the kids playing basketball down the street, the officers chatting with neighbors at the park, the choir rehearsing in the church basement. Silver Creek wasn't perfect, but it was better, and she had played a part in making it so. As darkness fell and stars began to twinkle overhead, Jasmine realized something important. Change didn't happen overnight. It came in small, steady steps, like drops of water carving paths through stone. It required courage, patience, and faith that even the hardest hearts could soften if met with kindness. And sometimes it needed a band that spoke softly,